And now I'd like to welcome Emily Foster-Hanson to talk about the causes and consequences of functional reasoning in social categories.
Okay. Well, thanks for having me, and thanks for everyone for being here. I am really excited to talk to you today about some of the work I've been doing with Tanya Lombroso. So from childhood, people know that humans make artifacts for specific functions, and we use our knowledge of these functions to both determine what kinds of categories things belong to, and also to evaluate them. So for example, if I told you that these things that you see right now were used to make a whistling sound, you'd probably agree with me that they're whistles. But if I told you instead that they're actually used to cut garlic, then you would probably agree that they're garlic cutters. And it really wouldn't matter whether or not they're very good at making a whistling sound if their function was cutting garlic. We see echoes of this same functional reasoning and how people often think about many natural kinds like animals. So people tend to assume that the features of animals serve some function or purpose, like how zebras' stripes serve the function as camouflage from predators. And they often think that because these features are functional, the animals themselves ought to have them. They serve this purpose. So in this way, the tendency to think about functions can explain the link between how we think things are in nature and our judgments about how we think they're supposed to be. This is sometimes referred to as the naturalistic fallacy, or the belief that what's natural must be good. In philosophy literature, it's also sometimes called the normative assumption, or the belief that things should express their natures and that normally they will. So if they don't, then it means that something's gone wrong. In the current work, we apply this framework to how we think about the social world. And we ask, do people think about gender categories as having functions? That is, do they tend to think that men and women or mothers and fathers have specific natural functions, and how does this type of reasoning relate to their normative judgments about what individual people are supposed to do? Here we focus on gender categories for three main reasons. First, gender categories are early emerging and they're stable throughout the lifespan. So they're possibly the main way that people divide up the social world in their everyday lives. Second, we suspected that there might be some big variation in how people think about different gender categories, with people possibly thinking of some categories, like mothers and fathers, as relational social roles that are associated with specific functions, but others, like boys and girls, they might see as more akin to natural kinds. And third, we thought there would probably be some good variation across individuals in beliefs about gender categories, both how strongly they endorse social gender roles, but also how much they think gender itself reflects objective differences in nature. So just to be clear here, the idea is not whether gender categories actually have natural functions, or even to assume that they're actually discrete or binary ways of dividing up how people really are in the world. The goal is just to point out that people are often inclined to explain the descriptive regularities that they see around them, like differences in society between people who identify as men and people who identify as women. And in particular, to ask if they assume that these differences serve some kind of functional purpose, like they often do about non-human animals. If so, this could be one reason why people, including some psychologists, often find evolutionary explanations for gender differences so appealing. And I'll also clarify that these assumptions about function are surely sometimes right, but they're also often wrong because people tend to think about evolution as improvement over time. This is a bias that peaks in early childhood, but it persists throughout the lifespan as an intuitive heuristic. So evidence of a tendency to assume that what's common must also be functional when thinking about gender should give us extra reason to be cautious about accepting evolutionary explanations for gender differences. Now, anecdotal evidence suggests that people definitely do think of gender in terms of natural functions, and that this reasoning has direct consequences for people's normative judgments. So take, for instance, this 1964 judicial petition arguing that men should control a family's finances in order to protect women's natural function as childbearers and homemakers. As for experimental evidence, people sometimes think of humans as a species as having a function that they ought to fulfill, like to reproduce. And at the more fine-grained level of social roles, people often reason that, for example, the function of doctors is to help people who are sick, and so that's what doctors are supposed to do. But it's not clear when and whether people think of gender in these functional terms. So in a pretest, we started out with 12 different social categories, which could be divided into 4 triads with matched masculine, feminine, and superordinate categories. And we just asked people, what's the true function of one of these 12 categories? We coded their open-ended responses into common themes, and this yielded a list of 15 unique functions. And in the main study, participants were then randomly assigned to rate their agreement with statements about the function of all 3 categories and one of the 4 triads. For example, a participant might rate agreement with statements about all 15 functions for fathers, mothers, and parents. We also asked participants how much they thought it was natural for members of the category to fulfill each function, and how much they ought to fulfill the function. Finally, we measured variation across participants and their background ideological beliefs about gender, specifically gender essentialism and ambivalent sexism. Agreement with functions was high overall, with people rating at least some functions as the true function of all 12 categories. But there was a lot of variation across the different categories. So here on the x-axis are each of those 15 functions, and on the y-axis is how much people thought that it was the true function of that particular category. People gave the highest ratings overall for parents and the lowest overall for kids. And there were also differences in the homogeneity of function ratings, with the most agreement across participants about the functions of parents and the least agreement about the functions of kids. We also tested whether participants' function ratings varied depending on their background ideological beliefs about gender, specifically beliefs that men and women or boys and girls have different functions. To test this, we computed a gender stratification score for each participant by subtracting their function ratings for each item for the masculine category they saw from their ratings for the feminine category and taking the absolute value of that difference. And we found that gender essentialism and ambivalent sexism had different effects for different social categories. So here on the x-axis are participants' ideological beliefs, and the y-axis is their gender stratification score. And we found that gender essentialism, so that's all of the ones on the bottom row, predicted endorsement of more stratified functions, so more different functions, only for males versus females and boys versus girls. Those are categories that people might be especially inclined to think of as innately different natural kinds. But benevolent sexism, that's the top row, only predicted endorsing more stratified functions for men versus women. And we didn't find any variation in participant beliefs predicting stratified functions for parents, possibly due to ceiling effects. So these results suggest that expecting functions to vary between gender categories because of different biological essences might be slightly different from expectations that gender roles entail specific functions in society. But across all 12 categories, participants thought that fulfilling true functions was natural for members of the category, and they thought that they ought to fulfill them. So here the x-axis is participants' function attributions, and the y-axis is their agreement with those ought statements. And each of these slopes is significant. So while functional reasoning about gender varies across different categories, and it's related to different kinds of background beliefs about gender, across the board, people definitely do think of gender differences as reflecting natural functions. And this functional reasoning can give rise to their normative judgments about what individual people are supposed to do. So this type of reasoning is both prevalent and also potentially has big consequences for people's lives. So if we return for a minute to our example, here beliefs about women's natural function licensed unequal and oppressive policies that maintain the status quo. And we can see this in the legal and judicial policies affecting us today. So for instance, just over a month ago, the Supreme Court officially reversed Roe v. Wade, declaring that the constitutional right to abortion, upheld for nearly half a century, no longer exists. This is a stark example of the consequences of thinking of men and women as having different natural functions that constrain what people are supposed to do. So in ongoing work in this project, we're testing how functional reasoning about gender relates to people's policy support. So I'm going to show you some pilot data looking at this that's really honing in on this idea of reproductive functions in particular. So we asked participants to what extent they thought it was a mother's true function to breastfeed, to prioritize caring for her children instead of her career, or to carry a fetus to term. And then we asked them to rate their support for policies protecting the individual right to do otherwise. And for all three of these issues, people who endorse the behaviors as natural functions of the category also agreed less with policies aimed at protecting individuals' rights to choose whether or not to fulfill these functions. So here the x-axis is again people's function ratings, and the y-axis is their support for these policies. So while humans are surely animals, and it would be irrational to argue that differences in genders have nothing to do with evolution, it's also irrational to assume that all of the gender differences that we see in modern society can be explained by evolution. But reducing people to their biological functions can justify denying them the agency to choose how they want to act in their daily lives, and thus denying them their full human status. So understanding when and why people think about gender in this way is an important step towards a more just society. So thanks for the opportunity to talk to you about this work, and thanks for listening. I'm going to put my glasses on for this part.
Hi, awesome work, and as you mentioned, super timely to talk about these types of things. I have a question. So a lot of research, present-day research into language and gender focuses on sort of the local nature of how gender gets constructed, and so the functional nature of categories is locally made. So in a setting where there is a barbecue happening, there will be the dad will be called on to make the barbecue happen, or those types of stereotypes and functions are very locally afforded. Your research here shows a very macro level, high level, aggregated types of stereotypes. And I was sort of curious to ask you to speculate on how the micro and the macro might link up here. Because on the micro level, we're talking about barbecues and who does them.
Right.
On the macro level, we're talking about super high level functions. Now, what's the connection between the two?
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to answer the part of that question that I have an answer to, which is, so this work is really looking at the role between like actual functional explanations, so the explicit explanations for why things are the way that they are. In daily life, I think people don't usually generate those explanations. What I really think is happening in the paper that I cited early on that Tanya and I have that's looking at animals, most of the time, I think what people are actually doing is encoding that information in their category representations. So they're representations of what's normal, what is typical for a category. This is going to be filtering all of the information that they have about what's frequent through their explanations about why it's frequent, and then that's what gets stored in their representations. In daily life, when people are making decisions like who's going to, light the fire on the barbecue when we're having a party, or who's going to wake up with a baby in the middle of the night, I think people usually are recruiting those normal representations and not necessarily thinking of those explanations in these really explicit terms. And there's a really simple explanation for why that would be true, which is that generating those explanations is just really costly. So, it would take more time to do that, and most of the time we're just sort of rushing to get to the next thing. That doesn't mean that the explanations don't play a role, though. It plays a role in the way that our background conceptual coherence and causal frameworks shape how we interpret the things that we encounter. So when we encounter those descriptive regularities and we're learning about what's normal, we encode all of that in those representations, and then that's what we call on. So that's my guess. Yes. Oh, hello.
Great talk. Super interesting work. I was wondering, thinking about the pilot data that you showed, it's actually kind of related to the last question, which is what's the causal relationship? I mean, I know you just have correlational data, but is it, I guess, in my mind, there's kind of two options. One is that, thinking about, the more that you think about gender as a natural kind, the more you support these things. But then there's a different option, which is that in the rhetoric around anti-abortion and these other issues that you brought up, that's what, politicians have been using. And there's so it's, the question is like, could you design an intervention that's like, it's abortion's natural, like, calling miscarriages self-abortions or something like that.
So I have some pilot data on that too.
Oh, cool.
But I'm still analyzing it. Because, conferences. Yes, I think that's a great, so there's sort of two pieces of that I would maybe pull apart. One is the extent to which this is just coming from the rhetoric.
Yeah.
And I would think maybe that's a bit of a circular extrapolation. So the rhetoric is being generated by people based on their background assumptions and expectations. So can we take the rhetoric as maybe indicating how people tend to think about these categories, potentially?
Sure.
I also think that for some of them, it's really hard to come up with an alternative. So the one about breastfeeding is a really interesting one. I mean, there's not much way in which you could argue that breastfeeding is not natural, although this was an argument that was put forth when formula became popularized.
Yeah.
And so, these are, it is true that people are influenced by the causal explanations and the types of descriptions that they hear people making for why things that they are the way that they are in their daily lives. The extent to which those actually can vary across individual people, but also across time and different political contexts is kind of an open question. And whether you can move people, I also don't know. So whether or not there's a way in which it could be that thinking about humans as biological natural kinds is like a particular stance that I can adopt, and I can think about people that way. And if you ask me, I can totally generate all kinds of explanations for why that's the case. But it may be that that's very unlikely for me to do because that's not how I usually think about them. And I also can adopt a completely different intentional stance where I'm thinking about individual agents and their goals. There's definitely got to be some flexibility, and the whens and the whys and the hows, I just don't know. That's a great question.
Cool. Thanks.
Thank you. Any other questions? Sure.
This is a minor thing, but there was a thing that I noticed in the graphs of like the function ratings for the different statements for like girls, boys, and kids, which was that girls and boys had like much higher function ratings than kids did, even though those are most of the kinds of kids.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah.
Do you have any explanation for that?
I have an explanation, which is my hunch because I don't have data to speak to it. But I think my interpretation of this is that it tells us that people think of gender as functional from very early on. So kids is the superordinate category, and the function of kids is a function, oftentimes a lot of the explanations that people were generating of kids was actually completely misunderstanding the question and saying the function of having kids. Because in society, we don't really think of kids as having any function. They're not supposed to do anything, right? I mean, I have a 7-year-old and his job is to play, right? So, but for gender, I do think that people have specific gendered functions, social roles that they think of even very young children as if not fulfilling, then at least being trained and getting prepared to fulfill. I mean, there's good reason why people give girls dolls, right? They're practicing to be mommies. So I think that's my interpretation of those data, but that's a great question. Any other questions? Are we all done? Okay. Thanks, everyone.